Hey everyone, welcome back to Maple Syrup Gaming, and today we're going to be looking at another controller review, the 8BITDO SN30 Pro. Now, this controller came out a couple of years ago, and it already has its bigger brother, the SN30 Pro Plus. However, those two controllers are such different beasts that I really wanted to do a separate review on each. Now, I'm actually really excited because this is the first time on the channel that we're going to be doing an all-around review on a controller that hasn't been modeled after either the Pro controller or the GameCube controller, but rather an even more retro controller. And if you're already familiar with the design, it's modeled after a Super Nintendo controller. It basically just means that rather than putting the emphasis on the joysticks, this controller puts the emphasis on the D-pad. And there are going to be some major up points and some major down points with this type of design. But we'll get to that really shortly. So if you're unfamiliar with the way I normally do my reviews, we're going to start with just an overview and a close-up of the product. Then we're going to switch to the review scores. And if you want to get a lot of details of exactly how I score my controllers, I have a specific video on my channel. I invite you all to go see it if you really want some major details, but you'll get pretty much everything you need out of this review. And don't forget that if you like what you see, please drop a like on the video and subscribe if you aren't already. The likes really do help a whole lot. Now, without further ado, let's get to the close-up. So first, as usual, I like to take a quick close-up of the box. Now we're going to be looking at this controller as a Switch controller. However, as indicated in the box, it's really interesting to know that this controller not only works with Switch, but it works with any Windows PC. It also works with Android, macOS, and even as a Steam controller. For the rest of it, the box is actually pretty bland. You have the 8BITDO symbol at the bottom. At the top, you just have the branding. The sides are actually bare, so I'm not even going to show them. And on the back, you once again have a close-up view of the controller with a repetition of the systems that they're compatible with. However, at the back, they also specify that it's compatible with the Raspberry Pi. So in the box, you get the controller itself and you get a charging cable. Now, I've got to say for the charging cable, number one, it's USB-C. And also, it feels like a really high-quality cable, which is really appreciated. However, the only thing, it's only 3 feet long. So when this controller is charging, you're going to have to be playing really close up to the screen if you want to keep using the controller. But if not, if you keep it charged and you make sure that it's always topped up, the cable is really high quality, although not that long. So now let's take a look at this controller. First things first, there are a few models available. Now I have the classic G model, which basically has the color and button design scheme of the classic Game Boy. However, the most popular model is probably the Super Nintendo model, which basically has the purple buttons and has the concave buttons on the Y and X. And after actually buying this controller and using the Super Nintendo model as well, I've got to say that there's a big choice to be made. It's not only an aesthetic difference, it really is a feeling difference. And if you want the most authentic and probably, in my opinion, most high quality feeling, I would go with the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom model and the Game Boy model that I have as a third place, just because the D-pad really doesn't feel as good as the Super Nintendo version. Now, if we go for the button setup, well, as I said it earlier, this controller really does a focus on the D-pad. When you're holding it, you're going to be holding it like a Super Nintendo controller, meaning that basically your thumbs are going to rest really easily on the D-pad. However, they are a little bit out of whack when you're using the analog sticks. And you'll see that later on in the review. That's a point that's going to come up, which basically sets exactly what type of gaming this controller is primarily directed for. Also, if you have larger hands, this controller will feel a little small, especially if you're used to the design now of the Pro controller, where basically you have grips on each side that sort of push your hands out a little wider. This controller is going to feel smaller in your hand, once again, sort of along the lines of a Super Nintendo controller. However, if we talk about button quality, it feels top-notch. I mean, these buttons are clicky and responsive. The D-pad feels really nice, and the analog sticks, although they don't have the longest travel distance, they are still very high quality. They click in really well, and you have no problem using them. You have your start and select buttons here in the middle that act as your plus and minus. You also have your home button here at the bottom and your capture button here on the left. Now the placement of these buttons here at the bottom are not the best. I mean, on a standard controller, we're used to having them up at the top and it's actually easier to reach them. So if you're playing a game that you regularly have to use the capture and the home button, you will unfortunately feel a little bit of discomfort when you have to hit them regularly. Now, if we look at the top of the controller for the triggers, you have basically raised up triggers for the R and L buttons, and the R2 or L2, which will act as your ZL and ZR buttons, are rather concave instead of being raised up. And it's okay, it gives that trigger feeling to them, but at the same time, the buttons are so close together that if you have to navigate a lot between the two of them, it's not the most comfortable situation. And because they're so small, the trigger buttons, if you're used to hitting them sort of off to the side, you're gonna have to change the placement of your fingers. Lastly, we have the syncing button at the top, also with here your USB-C charging port. Lastly, at the back, there's nothing special. We have no buttons, but there is a cheat sheet for the different syncing modes. So you don't have to worry about forgetting what button combinations you need for the Switch versus the PC and whatnot. So if you're using this controller for multiple systems, it's actually really interesting that 8BITDO includes that on their controller. Now lastly, if we go over the functionality of this controller, well basically it has rumble built in, not haptic feedback, but standard rumble, which is actually surprising for a controller of this size. It's wireless, it has a rechargeable battery, and it also has full motion controls. So any games requiring motion controls, this controller will be just fine with. However, it does not read NFCs. So basically amiibos, you'll have to be keeping a Joy-Con close to you. And lastly, although on all other platforms this controller has a turbo functionality, unfortunately on Switch it doesn't work because the turbo button is remapped to basically your capture button. And unfortunately for the SN30 Pro, there is no way to remap the buttons if you want to get access to that turbo functionality. So it just basically does not work on Switch. So lastly, I always like to show how to sync the controller really quickly. So if you go into the controller section of your main menu on your Switch, you go to the change grip order. And then basically for the Nintendo Switch, the combination is to hold down the Y button and the start button. You hold it a few seconds and you'll see the lights here at the bottom flash back and forth. And after a few seconds, your controller will be synced and ready to go. One last little important bit of information about this controller is that there are firmware upgrades available for it. However, to install them, you have to have access to a PC. You can't do it from your Switch. However, the process is really simple and available on the 8BITDO website. And I invite you to really update that controller if you can. It will make the syncing process quicker for your controller, and it's also improved the reaction time on the analog sticks and the D-pad. So it's one of those things that the upgrades are really worth taking the extra few minutes to really go and get. So here we are back and ready to get going on the scoring. Just before that, I wanted to talk a little bit more about this controller because there's a couple of points I want to go over before we start the scoring that will sort of set the stage. Number one, in my tone, I think you saw that there's a few things that I was sort of negative maybe on during the description, but I want to let you know that this controller I find is a great controller overall. It's just very strong in certain types of game situations and unfortunately a lot weaker in others. However, when it's great, it really is great. And the second point, and I did mention it quickly as well, is that I was a little disappointed that between the different models, the classic G model, the Super Nintendo model, and the Super Famicom model, that there was such a big gap between, I would say, the quality of the D-pad. Don't get me wrong, even on the classic G model, the D-pad is really good. It's just significantly better on the Super Nintendo model and the Super Famicom model, in my opinion. Even the plastic just feels a lot better on those other two models. And I just thought those were two important points to mention because, like I said, I might be referring to some of them back in the scoring and I wanted it to make sense for all of you. So now let's get to it. Let's start with the scoring for the build quality and the general feel of the controller. Now in this category, this controller is going to be getting a 3 out of 5. Now why is it getting a 3 out of 5? Well, first of all, I don't want you to worry at all. The build quality on this controller is top notch. It feels really good in your hand. It feels sturdy. The plastics they use are high quality plastics, and this is not a controller that I would worry about basically losing its efficiency after a few months of use due to low quality products. However, the overall feel varies so much between the type of game you're playing that's where it's losing its points basically. Because if you're playing a 2D platformer, and you'll see in the scoring later on, this controller feels awesome in your hand because you're holding it and you're using that D-pad primarily. However, if you're playing an FPS game and you're trying to basically place your thumbs on both analog sticks at once, the lack of basic grips on this controller really shows itself and it becomes an unpleasant experience. So it's a balancing act, and that's why it got a 3 out of 5. Now our second category are going to be the features and aesthetics of this controller. And in this category, it's going to be getting a decent 7 out of 10. Now, the 7 out of 10 is really easy to figure out. This controller basically has all the functions other than NFC. So it has that rechargeable battery, it's wireless of course, it has rumble, it has motion controls, and at the same time, I'm giving it a little extra point because of its versatility, being able to jump to PC and other formats. Even though that's not directly Switch related, it's such a strong advantage that I'm giving it the extra point. And it's also getting 2 extra points for its aesthetic, just because I love retro looking controllers, and the fact that you can have in your hand a controller that almost looks identical to a Super Nintendo controller, Super Famicom controller, however still giving you a modded aesthetic that allows you to play all your Switch games, to me is just worth those 2 extra points. However, I'm not giving it the extra point for the turbo functionality because it does not work on Switch, and it has no extra functions, which means that it can't score higher than that 7 out of 10. So now we get to the gaming scores. And the first section, as usual, is going to be our FPS or 3D act. And in this category, this controller is going to be scoring a 7 out of 10. As I mentioned earlier, this controller really did not have 3D games or FPS games in mind when it was designed. I mean, it works with these games. It has all the buttons you need and you can play them. However, using both joysticks at once without the presence of grips on this controller really becomes uncomfortable. You can do it for an hour or two, but longer gaming sessions than that, you'll start being tired because you have to use a really tight claw grip on the controller to have access to both joysticks at once. And secondly, controlling the character and the camera with both joysticks, or basically moving your character and aiming with the second joystick in the position they are, is really going to diminish probably your results in those gaming formats as well. Now if we move on to our second category, which is basically 2D platformers, or what we also call side scrollers. Now in this category, this controller is going to be knocking it out of the park with a 9.5 out of 10. This is really an awesome controller for 2D platformers and side scrollers, and basically it was designed with those games in mind. Now when primarily using the D-pad, the comfort level goes through the roof. If it was uncomfortable for FPS games, for 2D side scrollers it's just perfect. And the nice clicky responsive buttons on this controller are perfect for this game as well. The only thing keeping it from a perfect score is if that turbo functionality would be working on the Switch. Because for 2D side scrollers, you know, your classic Mega Mans and whatnot, these are some of the games that can profit the most from having a turbo functionality on a controller, and I was really disappointed when I found out that unfortunately it doesn't work when you have it in Switch mode. Now if we move on to another one of my favorite categories, 2D fighters. So we're talking about our Mortal Kombat, Street Fighters and all that. And once again in this category, this controller is going to be hitting an awesome 9 out of 10. Now if you're wondering why it's hitting a 9 out of 10, first of all I want to mention that for this category specifically, you really want the Super Famicom or the Super Nintendo edition, because the D-pad for rotating motions is slightly weaker on the classic G model. However, as in the previous category, what's really getting this controller scoring so high is the emphasis on that awesome D-pad and the placement and comfort level when holding this controller. And the only thing actually keeping it from perfection is basically having only 4 face buttons. Now I know that that is traditional design for a Super Nintendo controller. However, for the perfect fighting controller in my mind, this would have to have 6 face buttons as an option. And if you want to look at a previous video, that controller actually exists on the Switch. It just wasn't actually made for this console. Now we get to our last gaming category, racing games or kart racers. And this category, this controller is going to be getting another 7 out of 10. So why is 7 out of 10 in this category? Well, once again, it has to do with the placement of the analog sticks. Unfortunately, since most games nowadays force you to use the analog sticks to control your vehicles, well, it's a really uncomfortable affair for long periods of gaming sessions. And especially when you need to hold corners for a long time or do rapid motions to activate drifts, it's really not a controller that was built with these games primarily in mind. And the emphasis on the D-pad in these games is really just lost. So don't get me wrong, it's not that it's a bad controller, it's just that they are way better options for this type of gameplay. So now overall, that gives this controller a very decent score of 42.5 out of 55. And I've got to say that for a retro themed controller, I consider that a very solid score. And honestly, it was to be expected. When you have a controller that was basically modeled after a controller built in 1993, well, you can't really expect it to be the top controller in 2020. However, what this controller really does excel at is all 2D games. Basically, this is a controller designed with 2D games in mind. However, they added in what you needed to be able to play the 3D games if you need to. And I would say that this makes this the perfect secondary controller if you have the money to be able to buy a second controller other than having, let's say, a Pro controller or even a cheaper wired Pro controller. If you wanted to have a dedicated controller for 2D games, while at the same time, if you're stuck, being able to give it to a friend as a second player controller and play a 3D game with it, well then the 8BITDO SN30 Pro is the perfect option for that. Now price-wise in the US, this controller normally goes somewhere between $30 to $40, and it also sometimes depends on which exact model you're going for. However, at that price, it's a really solid buy overall, especially since it's offering all the same options as a Pro controller, just minus the NFC. Now just before we go, however, there are 2 last points I wanted to touch on this controller. Number 1, it has a big brother, as I mentioned earlier, the SN30 Pro Plus, which has basically a very similar design plus grips, meaning that it's probably going to be a much more well-rounded beast overall. But we'll be able to see that in a review shortly. But just keep that in mind before purchasing the controller, because you might want to check it out, see if it maybe fits more what you're looking for. And number 2, and this is maybe a message out there to 8BITDO if they have any way of fixing it, it's really disappointed that you can't remap the buttons on this controller to get access to that turbo functionality, because once again, referring to that SN30 Pro Plus, that option is available on that controller. You can remap the buttons and you can actually disregard the capture button and replace it by reactivating the turbo button on that controller, meaning that if you're playing a game where you know you won't be needing to get screen captures and you really want access to that turbo functionality, well, you can do it. However, it's not available at this moment on the SN30 Pro. I don't know if it's a hardware issue, meaning that it can never be available, but it's something to keep in mind that basically just disappointed me overall when I got the controller in hand, that there was really no way on the Switch to use that functionality. So I really hope you liked this review, and as usual, if you have any questions, any comments, if you've purchased this controller and you disagree with anything I said, I'd really like to hear about it in the comments below. So please leave your comments and I'll try to answer as many as I can. Also, one last quick reminder, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you aren't already, and activate the notification bell so you know when all my new content comes out. And as usual, I hope I'll see you in my next video.